Story 1. Sheriff Gideon Vance knew Black Creek wasn't normal. He had lived in Havenwood his entire life, and the creek had always been a whisper in the back of his mind, a place people didn't go after dark. It wasn't a place of legends or folklore, but a place of quiet, shared dread. His grandfather, the sheriff before him, had a saying: "Some things are better left sleeping, Gideon." Black Creek holds some of the deepest slumbers you'll ever find. For 20 years, Gideon had kept his distance. But a month ago, the sleeping things began to stir. It started with Clara Monroe, the city girl who bought the old Miller place on the creek. Gideon had found her cabin spotless, a half-finished painting on an easel, and a chillingly crafted doll with pebble eyes on the kitchen counter. He had heard the whispers from the water, a guttural, wet language that coiled around his mind, and he had seen the pale, featureless face beneath the surface. He'd told no one. He'd filed a report of presumed drowning, and left it at that. A week later, Leo Corliss, a nature photographer, vanished from his campsite near the creek's edge. This time, Gideon had found a low, rhythmic hum coming from the water, a vibration that thrummed in his bones. He'd seen the towering, gaunt figure made of gnarled branches, its pinprick eyes watching him from the treeline. He'd lied on the report again, citing presumed lost in the wilderness. Gideon knew a terrible pattern was emerging, one that stretched back decades. Every few years, someone would wander too close to Black Creek and disappear. The town had an unwritten code of silence. They had always chosen to look away, to offer up the lost as tribute for their own peaceful lives. But now, Gideon was a part of that terrible bargain, a keeper of the secret. The whispers he'd heard at the creek followed him back to town, a faint, persistent echo in his mind. The silence wasn't a solution, it was a symptom of the disease. The old stone town hall, which served as his office, felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, felt like a judgment. He was sitting at his worn oak desk, a stack of cold case files from the past 50 years piled high before him, each one with a familiar, haunting entry: last seen near Black Creek. He picked up the file on a local hunter, Silas Thorne, who disappeared in the spring of '88. Silas was a rugged man, a veteran who knew the woods better than anyone. His body had never been found. The last entry on the file was from Gideon's own father, the sheriff at the time. Searches concluded. No evidence of foul play. Presumed lost. Gideon ran a thumb over his father's neat, cursive handwriting. He had asked him about Black Creek once, as a boy. His father's eyes had grown distant. "There's a reason we don't build houses too close to the water, son. We give the land its due." The words meant little then, but now they carried the weight of a generation's complicity. He was interrupted by a sharp knock on his door. It was Deputy Miller, a young, earnest man with a shock of unruly blonde hair. Miller was new to Havenwood, transferred from a bigger city, still full of a naive, unjaded optimism. "Sheriff," Miller began, his voice low and concerned. "There's something you need to see. Up by the creek." Gideon felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. "What is it, Deputy?" Miller's face was pale. I don't know what it is. A structure. A stone circle, or something. It wasn't there last week." Dread was a familiar guest now, settling in Gideon's gut with a heavy presence. "Did you touch anything?" "No, sir. I took a picture on my phone, though." Miller pulled out his phone, his hand trembling slightly. He showed Gideon the image. It was a crude circle of large, river-worn stones, each one as tall as a man. The stones were covered in strange carvings, runes that looked like ancient, half-remembered sigils. In the center of the circle, a small effigy lay on the ground. It was a figure woven from twigs and twine, its head a smooth, dark pebble. Gideon felt the breath leave his lungs. It was another doll, almost identical to the one he had found in Clara Monroe's cabin. He hadn't told Miller about that. He hadn't told anyone. Did you feel anything, Deputy? Gideon asked, his voice barely a whisper. Did you feel a hum? Miller frowned. A hum? No, sir. Just a silence. A real deep, heavy silence. The hum was gone. In its place was an absolute, suffocating quiet. The price for the old one's silence had been paid. The whispers, the hum, they were gone. The stone circle was a trophy, a monument to a terrible transaction. It meant they were satisfied. For now. Gideon looked at the young deputy, at his unlined, expectant face. He couldn't keep lying. Not to this boy, not to himself. The time for silent complicity was over. Deputy, Gideon said, his voice firm, resolute. Get your gear. We're going to the creek. But we're not just looking for a lost hiker this time. We're looking for answers. As they drove, the silence of the woods pressed in, a physical weight. When they arrived, the stone circle was just as Miller's photo had shown, stark and unnatural in the fading light. Gideon knelt, his hand hovering over one of the stones. The runes carved into the surface were not symbols of a lost language. They were a story. He could feel it in the cold stone, a narrative of hunger, of slumber, of a debt paid with flesh and blood. The effigy in the center of the circle was not just a doll. The twine and twigs had been woven with a horrifying level of detail, and the stone head was chillingly smooth, with two small, perfectly round indentations where the eyes should be. They were waiting for new pebbles. Gideon knew then that the creatures of Black Creek were not just passive things that slept. They were intelligent, ancient, and they had a system. They had a language. They had a purpose. They were hungry, and the town had been feeding them. The hum was gone. The whispers had ceased. The silence was the real terror. It was the sound of a beast sated, waiting patiently for its next meal. Sheriff. Miller's voice cut through Gideon's thoughts. He was standing on the edge of the creek, his face a mask of awe and terror. Look. Gideon joined him. The creek was a dark mirror, as still as death. But just beneath the surface, faint and ghostly, was a luminous glow. It pulsed with a soft, bioluminescent light, like 100 fireflies trapped in a bottle. As he watched, the glow shifted, forming a series of patterns. It was the same language from the whispers, the same strange runes carved into the stones. The water was telling them a story, a history of the old one's hunger, a litany of names. The names of the lost. Silas Thorne. Leo Corliss. Clara Monroe. Gideon felt a surge of rage, hot and righteous, replacing the cold dread. The town had been living a lie, a comfortable lie built on the bones of its own citizens. He wouldn't be a part of it anymore. He would break the silence. He would expose the truth, no matter the cost. As he watched the names glow beneath the surface of the black water, he felt a chilling new awareness. The beast was full. But a predator never stops hunting. The silence was just the pause before the next attack. And this time, he was no longer a bystander. He was in the game. He was no longer a pawn. He was the target. Story 2. Ranger Elias Thorne was 2 years into his tenure at the White Pines National Park, and he was still a city boy at heart. He loved the solitude, the breathtaking vistas, and the quiet rhythm of the forest. But the quiet here was different. It wasn't peaceful. It was a vast, heavy silence that felt like a held breath. His routine was a predictable loop. Check the trails, monitor the wildlife cameras, and respond to the occasional lost hiker. That routine was shattered by a single, garbled radio transmission. Bravo Echo 7. This is Echo Base. We have a distress beacon in grid 4 to 9. Repeat. Distress beacon in grid 4 to 9. Status is unknown. Grid 4 to 9 was deep in the heart of the Pine Barrens, a section of the park so remote it was rarely patrolled. Elias felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The park's main office had a saying, "Nothing good ever comes from 4 to 9. He grabbed his pack, his two-way radio, and a .45 sidearm. The trek to the grid took hours, the path turning from a well-worn trail into a barely discernible deer track. The old pines grew thicker here, their branches weaving a canopy so dense that the afternoon sun was reduced to a few pathetic slivers of light. The air grew colder, heavy with the scent of wet needles and something else, something sharp and metallic, like ozone. Elias reached the coordinates just as dusk began to bleed into the forest. The distress beacon was an old, battered hiking GPS, its red light blinking weakly on the ground. Beside it was a single footprint, worn into the soft earth, a size 10 boot. But the most unsettling thing was the absolute stillness. Not a single bird sang. Not a branch creaked. The silence was so profound it felt like a sound in itself. He switched on his radio, the static a welcome comfort against the crushing quiet. Echo base, this is Ranger Thorne. I've reached the beacon. No sign of the hiker. The radio crackled. Copy that, Ranger. Await further instructions. Stay put. Elias stood still, his heart thrumming against his ribs. He felt watched, a familiar sensation in the woods, but this time, it was different. It was a sensation of being a specimen under a microscope, not of being a visitor in a wild place. Then he heard it, a sound so faint he almost dismissed it. A melody, a song he knew, but couldn't place. It was the lullaby his mother used to sing to him as a child, a tune from a faraway memory. He closed his eyes, straining to hear, and the music grew clearer, more vibrant. It sounded as if his mother's voice, rich and melodic, was echoing through the trees, just out of sight. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. The lullaby was cut short by a new sound. It was the unmistakable, heart-wrenching sob of a child. Not just any child. It was the sound of a little boy crying, the same high-pitched, desperate wail he had heard the night his younger brother, Sam, had fallen from their treehouse and broken his arm. Elias hadn't been able to help him then, and the memory was a scar. "Sam," he called out, his voice now desperate. He took a few steps, stumbling through the undergrowth, his mind reeling. The cries of a boy, the lullaby of his mother, what was happening? He stopped dead in his tracks. The sounds were everywhere, coming from no direction and all directions at once. The sobs of a child were joined by the frantic, panicked shouts of his father, the sound of a car crashing into a guardrail, the wail of a police siren. All the ghosts he had buried in the dark corners of his mind were rising, being played for him in the vast theater of the Pine Barrens. He was hearing every moment of his family's tragedy, the car crash that had left him an orphan. His radio crackled to life, the noise a sharp assault on his ears. "Ranger Thorne, what is your status? We're picking up. Is that a police siren?" Elias fumbled for the radio, his hands slick with sweat. I don't know what it is. I'm hearing things. My family, they're here. Ranger, those are not local signals. Get a grip, Thorne. What's happening?" Elias couldn't answer. The sound had shifted again. It was now a single, impossibly clear whisper, right beside his ear. It was his mother's voice again, but it wasn't singing. It was a plea, a warning. "He's listening, Elias. He hears everything." He whipped his head around, his flashlight beam cutting a desperate circle through the inky blackness. He saw nothing. But the whisper was so real, so close, it felt like a cold breath on his neck. Then he saw them. The pines. The ancient, gnarled trees were not what they seemed. Their twisted branches were not just wood. They were woven together, a network of fibrous sinew and muscle. The rustle of their leaves was not wind. It was the sound of 1,000 tiny, unseen mouths whispering. The cold air wasn't a product of the evening. It was the breath of something impossibly ancient, something that had been listening to the memories of every person who had ever walked through this forest, learning their hurts and their fears. The pines were not just trees. They were the entity. They were a living, breathing, sentient thing that fed on human despair. The sound he heard was not a trick of the mind. It was their collective consciousness. He looked at the single boot print near the distress beacon. It was worn into the ground, but it didn't look like it had been there for a few hours. It looked like it had been there for a long, long time. The hiker hadn't vanished. The hiker was part of the forest now, their memories the echoes that lured in the next victim. Elias stumbled backward, his hand fumbling for his sidearm. He was in a living, breathing organism. He was a trespasser in a monster's mind. He had to run. He had to get out. He wouldn't let them have his memories. He wouldn't let them become another echo in the pines. He turned and ran, the sounds of his family's ghosts following him, chasing him, taunting him with their impossible reality. He wasn't running from the trees. He was running from the echoes of his past, weaponized and aimed directly at him, a monster that had already won, a horror that had already taken root inside his own mind. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment and turn on notifications if you enjoyed the video so you never miss an upload.